the church, and clearly we started this study knowing full well that church is difficult, church is challenging, churches wind up being places where pain can occur and people can get hurt. That's all true. But what's also true is the church is the instrument that God gave us, and it plays such a vital role in our development and as disciples and how we move forward. So we're on chapter 9. The first half of the book was about all of the defeaters of the church. The second half of the book is about really kind of some of the answers to what is the role of the church, why is it so important to us. And thus far we've talked about how the church is a place where God speaks to us about identity and meaning and who we are. We talked about it as a greenhouse for exiles, a place where disconnected and disaggregated things come together and where people connect that maybe are disconnected. And then we talked about how we inhabit and participate in the drama of redemption here. And we talked about how church is really a rehearsal, or where we reenact what goes back 2,000 years, what was originally done in the church in terms of fellowship and coming together in prayer and study and so forth. And so week before last, we talked about a table for belonging, how hospitality redeems obligation and sacrifice in the church. And we talked about, first of all, the area of belonging, just how crucial belonging is. We went through all the research of people who are disconnected medically, emotionally, psychologically. We won't go through all that, but there's a significant difference in people who have church community and those who don't. And people debate on, well, what's the reason for that? But the research is actually very compelling. So we talked about that, and we talked about, as we look at that this idea of a table, the symbol of a table. We're going to talk a little bit more about that today. Is a symbol of how we come together as different individuals and fellowship and reinforce our role in community. And one of the things that he talks about, we've covered it throughout the book, is interestingly enough, it is his term is modernity is uniquely unsuitable and inhospitable to starting and strengthening relationship bonds. Doesn't have to be that way. We have incredible tools that would actually make it easier and better, but somehow we really struggle with the belonging piece. So the question then becomes, if belonging's really important, what goes with that? And where we got into last week was with belonging goes obligation. And we made a distinction. Don drove home a really important point at the end of our discussion. It's not about that we're saved by our actions in community. We're saved by grace. We can't create that. But part of the deal in becoming a part of Christ is being in community. That's part of the deal. And so we talked about that last time. And basically says in faith it means that we swear allegiance to Jesus and his household. I don't just invite Jesus into my heart. I join his flock. I become a part of his wheat. So, flock management's hard. We all know it's hard to be in a flock. And you just wouldn't believe some of the people that are in the flock. You just wouldn't believe. But that's part of the deal. There is a communal thing. And so with belonging, then goes obligation. And this obligation means certain things. And he says, salvation isn't conditional, but it does have strings attached. And the strings attached for us to develop as disciples means being in community. And it's interesting, he has a whole sub-chapter in there about reciprocity and reciprocal agreements, about how in relationship there is this give and take. and whether it's a marriage or a friendship or other members of a family, part of being in the tribe means there's some obligation that goes with that. And we really struggle at times because obligation can be oppressive, obligation can be negative, obligation can be life-giving. So this issue of obligation and freedom, idea of obligation and grace, how do all of those fit together? And we will not get that solved here, but I think he provides some insight about that that's really important to us. He says, for example, whenever in the Bible we see words such as covenant and household, those are words that describe the relationship we have in church. It is a covenant relationship, which means we're to hold up our end of the bargain, even if the other party in our mind does not. Even if the church doesn't, if the pastor doesn't, if the finance committee doesn't, if personnel doesn't, if my Sunday school teacher doesn't, we are a part of a covenant relationship. And so, that's part of a relationship, and I mentioned near the end last time, this word relationship has its root in the words to bear or to carry. Relationship. So the very idea of relationship is there is this idea of bearing or carrying others and being carried and being borne by others. It goes both ways. And so the Ephesians 2:19-22, believers are no longer outsiders, but fellow citizens with God's people and members of his household, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Jesus Christ as the cornerstone. The church is joined together, growing to a holy temple and a dwelling place for God by his Spirit. So, we've talked about that, and we've talked about how hard that is, and it's always been hard. And maybe there's forces today, we spend a lot of time on social media and things that have even made it harder to be connected together, because there's forces, there's things that we have control over that we didn't have 50 years ago that maybe make it harder. So with that, we then move into this whole piece that we studied last time was about redeeming obligation. So with obligation goes sacrifice. And so, you might say that the end state of obligation, the end state, is sacrifice. And so, when we think about redeeming obligation, we now today talk about redeeming sacrifice, and what does that look like? And it's interesting, I've struggled in this chapter because there's a lot to it, and I was thinking about it this last week. An example that we've discussed before, and I want to bring it back because I think it's a good example. We're all familiar with the story, but let me just read it. Back in 1918, a boy named Howard Loomis was abandoned by his mother at Father Flanagan's Home for Boys, which had opened just a year earlier. Howard had polio and wore heavy leg braces. Walking was difficult for him, especially when he had to go up and down the steps. Soon, several of the home's older boys were carrying Howard up and down the stairs. One day, Father Flanagan asked Reuben Granger, one of the older boys, if carrying Howard was hard. Reuben replied, "He ain't heavy, Father. He's my brother." So it's interesting. I think that is kind of the context for how we look at sacrifice. It wasn't that all of a sudden that Howard somehow became lighter. That weight was the same. So the question is, how do we redeem sacrifice in a way that helps us understand that statement? He ain't heavy. Yes, he is heavy. He's a burden. He's my brother. That somehow lightens burden and makes it possible. And so that's really what we want to dive into today. And so when we look at that, we look at sacrifice and we think about how we give to the church, I don't just mean money, and all the different ways that we give, that we sacrifice either with others in the church or in the name of God for others outside. How are we to give? When we sacrifice, when we give, we've had a lot of instruction over the scriptures, so forth. What's our mindset to be when we give?
Cheerful.
Yeah. There is scripture that says we are to be a cheerful giver. And sometimes we're more cheerful than others. And sometimes we're not cheerful in the moment. The cheerfulness kind of maybe comes later, if at all. So the question is, how do we do it? How else are we to give? So we're to give cheerfully. What else?
Generously.
Generously. Yeah, generously. What does it mean to give generously, if anything?
It has a cost.
It has a cost.
Maybe more than you're comfortable
A
with.
little more. In fact, we often say sacrificially.
Yeah.
We are to give not just comfortably, not just joyfully, but also sacrificially. And sometimes we do a little negotiation about that. How about 2? No, 3? Not 5? I mean, giving sacrificially is hard. And yet, what are the stipulations for giving? I mean, we don't have to give. So if we give joyously, if we give generously, we give, I hate this word, obediently? Obediently? No, surely not. And in fact, I think when we look at why are people reluctant to be a part of church, I was away from the church for 20 years. And if I look back on it, there were a number of reasons. I had some new understanding. It was different than the way I was raised, and I had to process all that. But one of the reasons I didn't want to give in the church is they would ask me to do something, to give something. And it's interesting. We often talk about money, and most pastors hate to talk about money. But actually, it's not just money. What else do you have to give? Time. What else? Energy, yeah.
A lot of patience sometimes.
A lot of patience sometimes.
Yeah.
Pain, sometimes it doesn't go well. I sacrificed all this stuff, and look what happened. Totally fell apart. It doesn't say we're to give successfully, we're to give faithfully, which implies that we might not always like the outcome. And in fact, throughout scriptures, we see all kinds of outcomes along the way that are unfair, that are unjust, that are all of that. And so, joining a church, being a part of a community, and it's not just church, being part of a family, being part of any group, it takes from us a cost. It takes a cost, to your point, Ellen. So, this idea of building relationships wherever we go would mean what? Costly.
Yeah.
We'd have to bear, to carry others. And so that's part of the deal. And he makes this statement. He says, just one other thing. How do we square the fact that we are to give in a way that's sacrificially, which is a cost that may actually be hurtful, may be painful, and to give joyfully? How do we give in a way that's painful and also joyfully?
I think it helps us distinguish our wants and our needs. And when we give up some of our wants to give, even though we don't want to, then when you can see results, when we see the progress of the people in Malawi, when we see how we've helped the school, Otto Middle School, not only, their teachers and their students, when we see how we've help some of the refugees that have come here and hear that they're grateful. I mean, it gives you, like, it ain't heavy then,
Yeah, it ain't
right?
heavy,
It ain't
exactly.
heavy.
And what that kind of, I think, implies, and that's a great way of putting it, is that, that burden is heavy, and he's my brother, love. That love redeems burden.
Yeah,
Not always in the moment.
right.
It might take a while, maybe later today, maybe a week from now, maybe a year from now. But we look at it, for those in the world of accounting and finance, we look at it not as an expense, but as an investment. And not all investments return exactly what we like, but we have that long term because we see from time to time what it does for the name of Jesus, for those who receive it, and for us. And when we do it without an expectation of the short-term expense return, but the investment long-term, we find it's transformative. And it's interesting, he ain't heavy, he's my brother, defies physics. It defies physics. The actual weight gets lighter. And I've experienced that in my life, and I would guess anyone in here would say the same thing. There's been times when I had something before me I had to do, and I didn't have enough love in and of myself. But when I pray and lift it up to God, he somehow helps lighten the load. Not immediately always. Sometimes it's a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. But over time, it is transformative. And it makes that which is heavy less heavy. My yoke is light. It can make heavy stuff light. Doesn't make it easy, doesn't make it not costly, doesn't do any of that. But in the view of investment, the long term, as opposed to immediacy, expense and income right this second, that it has that characteristic of investment. And so, and I've learned that lesson over and over again. It doesn't mean the next time there's something in front of me that I don't want to do, that I won't go through the exact same. I mean, it's the lesson that never fully gets learned, because I have to learn it over and again. And I start negotiating, oh God, not this. Is there some way? Is there another way? Could I skirt this? Could I avoid this? Could I go around this? No. Got to go through it. And so that's so much the part of our journey. And so,
Yeah, Robert,
yeah.
sometimes the payoff is imaginary. I never know.
exactly.
I never know. I give money to a political candidate and the son of a gun loses.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
what payoff is
Yeah.
there for that?
Yeah,
I
exactly.
have to project, imagine
Yeah.
that somewhere, hope, whatever,
Yeah.
that somewhere
Yeah.
down the line,
Yeah.
it made a difference somehow.
I give faithfully,
Yeah.
not successfully, toward
Yeah.
success.
Yes,
And-
because sometimes we never see
Sometimes
the
we never
benefit,
know.
if there is one.
And sometimes our best view is it didn't make any difference
Right,
in what we could see.
right.
And thankfully, we might, I don't know if we become greatly arrogant or depressed if we could see it all. Because at times we've been very depressed, because there's things we do that we think we gave a really gallant effort that, didn't do what I expected it to do.
And part of the tension is, and I'm not throwing my husband under the bus, but part of the tension is that my projected value and his projected value may not always line up.
Absolutely, absolutely.
No.
And
Surprise!
and I think one of the things that happens in our relationships, in fact, is that we bump into each other on that stuff. We do with spouses, we do with other family members, we do with church members, we do with small group members. At times, we have a very different view of what is valuable and what isn't. And in fact, what one person thinks is valuable, we may think is disgusting. And vice versa. They may actually think That is disgusting. And so that's our challenge.
Jen and I were listening to artist we like, Kev Moe, this morning, because he always has great words. And he starts this song, and he's talking about this suitcase he's got. And he always carries it with him everywhere he goes. And then the next verse is about this baggage that he goes everywhere he goes. And then he goes to break in the song, and he comes back, and the next verse out of the break, he meets his woman. And he's shocked at how much baggage she's carrying.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, one of the things I think that gives us a struggle for compassion is we don't see the baggage that other people are carrying. We may see parts of it, we may see a little of it, but we may not see it at all. And from time to time, someone who really rubs us the wrong way, is on the wrong side of politics, wrong side of theology, acts just in such a way that it's hard for me to tolerate. When I understand more of their baggage that they're carrying, it makes a little more sense. And my guess is, if we could see all of it, it would make total sense, including ourselves. We're all carrying some baggage we know about, and we're carrying some baggage that hasn't quite been named and identified, but that is affecting, what we're doing.
It's like when the Indian saying about walking in the other's sand.
Yeah. Walk a mile in the other shoes. Exactly. And so this is where sacrifice and obligation shows up when we don't have clarity. And thankfully sometimes we don't have clarity. And other times, boy, it would have been really great if I'd have known. And we can't necessarily distinguish between those. So it's interesting that, when we look at sacrifice, and clearly, to your point, Ellen, the example, there's things we give ourselves to that seem not to work out at all. But typically, when we give faithfully, the thing that's most guaranteed, it'll help us. It's like I used to say when we're volunteering at Interfaith. Well, some nights you go down there and you think, man, look what a difference I made. I mean, man, they had this breakthrough, they laughed, they cried, it changed their lives. Aren't I a hero? And then there's other nights you go down there and you say, I spent 3 hours and absolutely nothing happened. Absolutely nothing. That was a waste. So what I came to say is that what I know for sure is not that any of them will be changed, but that I'll be changed. That when I give sacrificially to a cause that I feel called to do, I, by giving faithfully, will be changed for the good. I may grumble about it and complain about it. That's all legit, but I may very well do that. So, this issue of sacrifice and obligation is so hard, and inevitably, sooner or later, we talked about this before, what I'll be asked to give, there's kind of a, there's Maslow's hierarchy of kind of basic needs. Well, there's a hierarchy of things I'm willing to give. And there's some down at the bottom, I'm all in. I can give those no problem. And it's either because I like to do it or I feel good at it or whatever. But inevitably, if we stay in the game long enough and are sacrificial and obligated sufficiently, we'll be asked to give the most precious thing that we have. I just find it over and again that somewhere along the way we'll be asked to give something and we say, oh God, not that. I'm not good at it. I don't like doing that. That's not me, that whatever. And so it's interesting when we look at it that we wind up at times giving things that seem fairly easy, and then often over time in relationships and in our relationship in faith, we're asked to give something that's really precious to us that we don't want to give. And that's part of the costly discipleship, to use the term, that's a part of our growth. And sacrifice, it's interesting, I won't do justice to it, but Richard Rohr had a comment, I think it was last week, that sacrifice and pain are God's alarm system. The alarm system goes off, often around pain and sacrifice. That's the way we know we're often really into something significant. It's the alarm system for our willingness to be sacrificial. So And it's interesting, one of the things that has happened through technology today is, in many ways, it's easier to give and to sacrifice in certain areas without being in relationship. You know, GoFundMe is a great thing, and it often does great things. But GoFundMe is different than showing up to help someone that's in need. To physically and relationally show up. Those are both sacrificial, not saying one of those is bad. But again, part of the deal is sooner or later we'll be asked to give sacrificially in some areas that really takes what's precious from us or what's difficult for us to offer.
I kind of think the church does the same thing.
Church does, yeah, exactly. Exactly. And in what ways are you thinking? You know?
A lot of us contribute, but a lot of us don't get our hands dirty.
Yeah, exactly. Or we get our hands dirty in this area, but not. So we find areas that are more comfortable or whatever. And it's interesting.
And it takes those to make it function.
It does. And one of the things he talks about is like, you know, giving to the operating fund is not nearly as sexy as giving to someone whose house just burned down. You know, paying for administration, gee, that's not very. You know, and yet that's very much required to keep, you know, so we don't get to pick and choose just the things that make us feel good. We actually have to give to some areas that don't feel good, that don't quite do it for us.
That's like designated funds.
Exactly.
You know,
Yeah.
nonprofits hate designated
Exactly,
funds
exactly.
because they need to be able to spend the money to pay the rent or whatever. And instead, they have some little pot of money
Yep.
that's for some,
Yeah.
you know, in memory of someone to be used only for this.
Exactly. And, you know, that's why we always give to general funds.
Yeah.
Because, and in fact, the bind nonprofits wind up in is I can come up with this thing that will raise money and people like to give to it, but it's not the same pot as this that I need over here that's not sexy at all, you know, no one cares about, so forth and so on. And so, you know, part of the deal when we talk about building relationships wherever we go, wherever we go is kind of a, you know, that's kind of a load because we don't know wherever we go who we're going to wind up, you know, doing that with. And so that's, you know, that's part of our challenge. It's interesting that he talks about, I'm going to read this verse, what Hal mentioned earlier. Each of you should give what you've decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. He loves a cheerful giver. He often has to do some work on us to get us to cheerful. In fact, just one degree shy of complaining, and you know, is often where we are. And it's interesting. This is a verse from 2 Corinthians 9:12-15, and it's just interesting how he ties this in. And this service that you perform, talking about giving, in all the ways that we serve, is not only supplying the needs of the Lord's people. So yeah, it's taking care of them. But it's also overflowing in many expressions of thanks to God. Many expressions of thanks to God. I'm going to come back to that. Because of the service by which you have proved yourselves, others will praise God for the obedience that accompanies your confession of the gospel of Christ and for your generosity in sharing with them and everyone else. So 2 terms of expression of thanks, sharing with them. And in their prayers for their hearts will go out to you because of the surprising grace God has given you. Thanks be to God for his incredible gifts. And what's interesting about this first statement about the needs of the Lord's people, but it's also overflowing in many expressions of thanks. The actual Greek word there is Eucharist, or Eucharista. So the idea of the Eucharist, of communion, is a place of giving thanks. You know, and if there's, I think if there's anything I've learned in life, is that if we can find things to be thankful for, to have gratitude for, that, and in fact, I'll get to a great quote he has in a minute. So one part of this is expressions of thanks. That's communion or the Eucharist. And the second one, your generosity in sharing with them, is from the word koinonia, which is sharing with others. So he uses those two words in the Greek, which means Eucharist, and koinonia, which is basically sharing with others. So expression of thanks shared with others. That's what communion is. That's basically, those two terms are the terms that are used with that. Both are used for words of the sacrament. And here's a quote I really like. He says, "Thanksgiving is a central Christian virtue intended to replace despair, anxiety, and worldly worries. Thanksgiving is to repair despair." Thanksgiving is to repair despair. And if there's anything I found, you know, one of my favorites saying, the grace or the gift that comes in the middle of the storm is most precious of all. When we can be thankful for what we have in the midst of the storm, that's the most precious thing that we can have. And it's interesting. It's one of the reasons that, I don't know, anybody in here keep gratitude journals? I really recommend it. I recommend it because I haven't done it recently, but I've done it before. And starting each day with 2 or 3 things I'm thankful for. And often the thing to be most thankful for is the very thing that goes with the despair or challenge you face. So often in the midst of our greatest despair, there are things to be thankful for that are really valuable. You think of any examples of where gratitude or being thankful in the midst of whatever is despair has been meaningful for you. Examples? Yeah.
I went through a really difficult time recently dealing with a really difficult person. But I did it on behalf of someone else. And my gratitude after a while, not in the moment, was that an experienced person, me, was the one who had to deal with it.
Yeah.
Rather
Yeah.
than it being
Great
dumped
example.
on someone with less experience about that particular
Yeah.
issue.
Yeah.
So it was really hard. I hated every moment of having to deal with the person.
Mhm.
But that, a couple of weeks later, has been my gratitude.
Yeah.
That someone spoke up and alerted me to the problem.
Yeah.
And then I was able to deal with it rather than, I was the person to deal with it, although I did not want to. I had to,
Great example.
and
Yeah.
I was the best one to have had to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, in fact, what if the single most valuable gift, grace, value we will receive is likely to be in the midst of our greatest challenge? What if that's true? I found that often to be true. And I've also found at times where I've had a difficult time searching for what to be thankful for. And sometimes it takes a while to get to a place where I can say, I'm thankful for that. Yeah.
I think it's also when God gives us characteristics that we didn't know we had.
Yeah.
And in the midst of a storm, and He creates in you sort of a new personality or a new strength that wasn't your strength before.
Yeah. And in fact, you can feel that there was some kind of divine presence
Mhm.
that energized or enabled or exercised that beyond what I say I knew I could do. Yeah, absolutely.
And I think community is often part of that. You know, in
Yeah.
dealing with my extremely difficult person, I reached out to others
Yes.
and checked my perception
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
got ideas and
Yeah.
was strengthened by their prayers
Yeah.
and their insights.
Yeah. You know, a part of that, is this thing about community, and that's that second part, gratitude, thankfulness, and sharing with others. And, you know, that old quote by a person that's not quite as highly regarded as it maybe once were is 80% is just showing up. And I find over and again, and I experience it at church, that I may see someone across the room, I may see someone as they're going down to communion, I may hear a testimony like Larry gave a couple of weeks ago about what happened. And just showing up is 80%. And sometimes I'm reluctant to show up. And when I say show up, I mean show up fully present, fully there, without an agenda, just showing up. And one of the things, we talked about it a couple of weeks ago, one of the things that happens here at Canyon Creek and in any church is there's a group of people that most every Sunday show up. They show up, and just by showing up, there's such opportunity, and showing up with others. Sometimes one of the hardest things that we do with those that we're struggling with, where there's strife and so forth, is to keep showing up. And one of the best pieces of advice I ever got was an executive from Seattle was talking about what had been really important. And he said, what I found is I just have to keep the dialogue going, even when it's uncomfortable, even when the words aren't there. Now, that doesn't mean there's not times we can be in abusive relations back out. But the ability to show up is a gift that we bring when we don't know what to say, we're not sure how it's going to go, when it's uncomfortable. That's one of those gifts of community. And sometimes it's one of the hardest things to do. And it's hard to show up when things have gone badly. It's hard to show up at a church when things have gone badly.
Especially if it's your fault.
And
Perceive it to be your fault.
Exactly.
Right? You know?
And it's also hard if you perceive it to be somebody else's fault,
Yeah.
who's in leadership or
Right.
whatever, or calling the shots or doing whatever. It is really hard to show up. And yet we are called sacrificially to show up. And sometimes that takes everything that we have. And it doesn't promise success. It doesn't mean if I show up, oh, it'll be great, it'll be wonderful. No, sometimes it'll be kind of awful, and it won't go well. And yet, that's the part of showing up sacrificially and showing up faithfully, as opposed to showing up for success or for things going well or for it to feel great. You know, I mentioned that Jack Noble sermon, feeling good is not the same as feeling God. And sometimes it doesn't feel good at all. And so that's part of that thing that when we look at the whole idea of sacrifice, sacrifice is about helping others, but sacrifice is about helping us, because that's part of the deal. And he has a quote next. Paul isn't saying don't feel obligated to give if you don't want to, in terms of being cheerful. No, but if we don't feel the faith to give, if we don't feel the faith to give cheerfully, we don't fully apprehend, we don't fully grasp the indescribable grace that we've been given. We miss out on it. We miss the opportunity that is afforded in it. You know, so that's that deal of seeking to understand the grace, seeking to do it cheerfully, even when it doesn't feel like it. You know, sometimes we fake it till we make it. It's interesting, there was a piece, Rick Warren was talking about small groups and how important they've been. I think they have like 5,000 small groups out of Satellite. I mean, it's a huge number. And he said, and he talked about one of the small groups he's been in for years and years. And he says, and honestly, I don't always want to go to small group. We don't always want to go to church. Don't always want to go to Sunday school. Don't always want to do a whole series of things. And so there is this thing of doing it sacrificially, even when it doesn't feel good. He kind of ends here by saying there is a remarkably strong and consistent correlation between giving and belonging. You sacrifice for what you love, and you love what you cheerfully sacrifice for. So, you know, there's a consistent correlation between giving and belonging. So that's, you know, that's part of the deal. So the final section we get into is this radical hospitality. Two parts to that. What is radical hospitality? What does radical sacrifice look like?
Out of your comfort zone?
Out of your comfort zone? Yep. What else?
Done by somebody you don't know.
Yeah, maybe to a stranger.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting. One of the things he talks about is that the hospitality is also to the stranger. It may even be to the enemy stranger, those on the other side. When we think about strangers, who are strangers? Who are the strangers in our lives?
People we don't know.
People we don't know, sure.
Yeah.
People who
Take too long in front of us at the
take,
grocery store.
exactly. That person there that's on their phone when the light turns green for an eternity, maybe even 3 or 4 seconds. The same thing, 3 or 4, an eternity.
That's true.
When I'm in a hurry.
Think about the word stranger. They're strange.
Exactly. They're strange, and we are estranged from them. And, we often think of the stranger, one of the strangers is the immigrant. One of the strangers is those who disagree with me on my view of what immigration should be. Whatever side I'm on that, wherever I am on that. The stranger is that one on the other side they either don't know or I feel separated from, even feel maybe a little like they're an enemy or oppressive, or they might, So this idea of the stranger, that's where hospitality really begins. And, I love that passage, Luke's version of the, love God with all your heart, mind, soul, love your neighbor yourself, and who's your neighbor? And then go into a whole diatribe about who the neighbor is. And we get into the Samaritans, are you kidding me? That's an example of that. And so this idea of giving sacrificially also means giving to those that we, and by giving, I mean being present, by showing up, by engaging, by, like you say, not pushing their cart forward when they're in front of it. I'm aware it's really warm in here. I hope everybody's okay. I don't know what's happening, but it is really warm.
It's sacrificial.
It's sacrificial. That's right.
Get out of the fires of hell!
There you go. So when we look at hospitality, it's not comfortable hospitality. It is hospitality that is such a key part of our faith. He says hospitality's counterfeit is entertainment. It's interesting. What's the difference between hospitality and entertainment? What's entertainment? Fun. Just one way. Just taking it in. So it's interesting. Hospitality may not be entertaining. So it's interesting. He says, every time we read Scripture and come across familiar language or words like covenant or household, it isn't saying that the church is like a family or household, but that we are one. It's not like our group here, our small group, a group in the sanctuary. That's not like they're like a family. They are our church family. And so he says self-belonging is impossible once we come to the end of ourselves. And so the enemy in all this, the obstacle, is what I want for myself. And when we come to the end of ourselves, that's when we're opened up to be available then to serve or be with someone else. So he says our loneliness epidemic is significantly worsened if we never fully commit to any community for fear of not belonging as easily or as deeply as we like. I had lunch this last week with an old friend from college, and I don't in any way mean to judge him, but we're about to talk about church. And he mentioned that he's going to 2 churches. He goes to one church twice a month, and he goes to another church twice a month. And I thought that would have been my perfect definition of church when I first came to the church, where almost like an entertainment model, where I go and I kind of get what I need, and then I leave before anyone asks me to give something back. And so all of us have, I can talk about him, I still have my own version of that. It's not like I'm beyond that same thing of I'd like to just receive. Do I really have to give in the areas that are uncomfortable or aren't good? And of course, what we all know is that when we choose that path of not giving of ourselves, the rest of the world will still go on, but it undermines us and our faith. So the last thing that we get to is this if-then statement that we're all so familiar with. So it's at the end, and they getting ready to get right down to it, and so they're together, and Jesus says to Peter, what? Do you love me? Oh, yes. Oh, yes. If you love me, feed my sheep. Feed my sheep. And it's interesting how that really kind of nets out. And we want to say, well, what do you mean feed? Does that mean I'm going to have to give something away? And by the way, which sheep? Not the headbutting ones, not the stinking ones, surely, not the ones that I really struggle with. We say, yeah, exactly those. Feed my sheep. The stranger, the ones from which that I think are strange, the one from which I am estranged. Yeah, all of those. Those are the sheep that I'm asking you to feed. Ellen?
Well, the great philosopher Tom Beamer pointed out that Jesus never said, sing me a song.
Right.
Jesus never said, worship me.
Yeah.
He said, feed my
Feed
sheep.
my sheep. If you love me, it couldn't be much more simple.
Yeah.
Feed my sheep.
And for, in Lynn's case, keep her out of the attic.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and then there's that, yeah.
Then there's that, yeah.
So it's interesting, and one of the reasons that we come to church is to be fed, because in order to feed others, we've got to be fed. But if we just come to be fed and won't do the other part, then we miss the boat on that. So if you love me, feed my sheep. And it's interesting that he says, he comes back to this idea of the table, of being that the table is a symbol of where we come together. And it's interesting, he says, Jesus knew Judas would give him over to death by crucifixion. Grace gave him a seat at the table anyway. It's interesting. Remember we did that whole thing on the tricliniums in here and where people were seating. It's not like the one that in the Last Supper artwork. It's their triclinium. Jesus invited him to the table even though he knew he would, for 30 pieces of silver, give him away. And the fact of the matter is, he also knew Peter would deny him. He knew the others would scatter. He knew it wasn't going to go well. That's the definition of doing it faithfully, as opposed to based on my projection of the outcome. Doing it faithfully. We show up. We do it. It's in God's hand is the outcome. We're responsible for the faithful piece. He says the episode began around a table, around the Lord's table. It is not an accident. It is not an accident that it all happened at the table. And it's interesting, just as a follow-up, after Jesus' resurrection, after the nets filled with fish, the whole story, fished all night, nothing in the nets, fish on the other side, nets are running over, and Jesus is on the shore. After the nets filled with fish, after they finished eating on the shore, so there was evidently a table or some semblance thereof, Jesus asked Peter, Do you love me? Feed my sheep. He said it. We know scripturally when people repeat things, he said it 3 times, not once. Feed my sheep, feed my sheep, feed my sheep. And so when we look at this idea of belonging and our terrible need to belong, and how the research shows that when we're not a part of community, medically, psychologically, emotionally, we don't do as well. So the Creator who knows us and knew that, knows also that we live in an era today where it's easier than ever not to be at the table, to be on a screen, to be remotely or whatever. That he said the table is where we come together, and that our role is to show up in community to receive, but also to give, and that in the giving, when we give, it ultimately comes back to what happens is he becomes not heavy, he or she becomes our brother. That's the magic of it. That's the transformative power, is that when we give sacrificially, it doesn't occur necessarily in the successful way that we envision, and it may be wildly more successful than we envision, but it is transformative. And the church, in many respects, is a table. I mean, that's a great symbol for the church. We all go to communion once a month in this church, but in small groups, and here and so forth, it's at the table. That's the symbol of showing up. And what's great about it in community is if we gather at the table, here or in there or whatever, and we're not there, someone will notice the lost sheep. We will be identified not just by our presence, but in relationship by our absence. So that's, I think it's maybe one of the hardest asks he has for us, is for us to show up and to give when we're all selfish. And in a consumer society where we have over and again been able to buy gadgets and software and screens that automate and make easy what used to be hard, is maybe there is a cultural force that reinforces us right now in the search for what's easy, as opposed for the search for what's faithful. Takeaways. What are the takeaways?
The whole Bible is about change. And I think that's what God's doing. If you go back in the ancient history, what he was doing is, God knows where this needs to go.
Yeah.
He has patience. And
We don't.
And we don't. And the questions that he asks are very awkward. Do you love me?
Yeah.
You know when I'm getting ready to answer that question, what's going through my head is like, when I answer this, I'm not going to like the answer.
This is a trick question. Mayday, mayday.
All sorts of alarms are going off.
No
Do
kidding.
you love me?
No kidding.
Even with Beth, if she asks that, I know I really done something wrong now. But
Just wait it
the Bible's about change. God just wants us to change, no matter how subtle we are.
It's such a great point.
Yeah.
I'm in a group of retired ministers. I don't know why, but any other meet at Mill Ranch every year and so forth. And it's interesting to me in this group of retired pastors how they are grappling, just like all the rest of us, with change at this late stage in their careers. And they're seeking and they're struggling with change in the same way. I wouldn't have said it explicitly, but I think implicitly I always thought, gee, at some point you kind of say, I got this figured out.
Mm-hmm.
That, I don't have to change anymore. I got this. I understand it. I got it. I'm good. And that's not the way life works. And that's not the way God works. Said many times, getting old. I'm a rookie. Less than I was a year ago, but I'm a rookie at being old. And there's all this new stuff. For people who retire, who've worked all their career, it's a real adjustment for you and whoever your significant other, your spouse or whatever, for all of a sudden change. And then I can look at people around this room who have issues around health of a spouse or loss of a spouse, or their own health issues that is really limiting them. And they've never dealt with that before. And yet, in all of that hardness and harshness, is the opportunity for him to continue to develop us and continue to move us to another level. And I hate it, because I thought by now I was supposed to have it all figured out. And I also thought if I did all these things, everything would be in pretty good shape.
Or maybe God would just leave you alone
Yeah,
after a
yeah.
while.
Not only am I retiring from work, I would like to retire from you. Leave me alone. I don't need any more.
She's a lost cause.
And it just keeps happening, the change. And we keep being asked to show up in places and show up in circumstances that we never imagined. That we thought, oh, gee. Or we thought somebody else would have to show up in those circumstances. I've read stories about people who have that going on in their family. I've heard examples of that, but I didn't think it was going to happen to me. And it does. And rich or poor, or whether you've been at this a long time or you're new to faith, that's part of the deal. That's a great point, is the change never ends. It'd be great if we could just embrace that, but I don't.
I have to piggyback on this a bit. But God does give us examples. I mean, all through the Bible are examples. Around this room are examples.
Wonderful examples, yeah.
Great examples to teach us how to change and how to get in relationship with God.
And one of those is, that clock's just a little early, we'll get out in just a minute. But one of those is that in fellowship, in that koinonia that he talks about, our pain is to be our gift to others by sharing it. Not just the pretty part, the good, the bad, the ugly, and we decide how far we go with that. But when we are not transparent about what's going on in our lives, it encourages others to not be transparent about what's going on in their lives, and we miss out on a whole level of depth of what's real, not what looks good, but authentically what's real. So our pain is to be, as well as our sacrifice, our gift to others. And we do it in community. We do it around tables. We do it in this faith community. And today, maybe more than any time in my lifetime, when it's harder to get people together, post-COVID and all the things you can do, you can buy groceries and do all those things, maybe we need the table more today than any time that I can remember. Because we used to have to get out and do things, and now it has to be a matter of intention. Church is an intentional opportunity to be present and be in community when we have less of those avenues than we've ever had before. Any other takeaways? Anything else? Closing prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we so struggle with the ways you would ask us to show up. We struggle with the change that you bring before us, that is to be our opportunity to develop, that we often want to avoid. Take us from here today. Make us available to show up fully present in those circumstances and with those people and with the means that you would have us show up, so that they may benefit, that your name may be glorified, and that we may develop as disciples. In your name we pray. Amen.